All right, hello, ladies, and welcome to our population ecology note video. So, the first thing that we need to do is define population. A population is a group of individuals that belong to the same species and live in the same geographic area. Now, in order for us to recognize a population, we have to define that geographic boundary. So, regardless of what population we're studying, we have to specify where we're looking at this population. So, for example, if we wanted to study the emerald ash borers in the woods that's in my backyard, that could be a population. Or if we wanted to study those same borers in Lucas County, that's a different population. If we wanted to do that in Ohio, different population. Or in all of North America, those are all different populations. Each of these could be defined as a population, but obviously the numbers and things are going to be different in different spaces. So, just some examples geographic boundaries can be anywhere, and they can be as big or as small as we define them as. Now, populations, we have ways that we can describe them and that we can talk about a population. So, those include things like range, density, distribution, and growth rate. Let's first talk about range. Range is a geographic area in which a species can be found. It's often presented as a map, and that just shows us where that species is located. Then we have population density, and that's the number of individuals per unit of area or volume. Typically, when we're talking about volume, we'll talk about if something is in an aquatic environment, and area is normally for terrestrial environments. So for the beetles down here, this would be maybe we have a square meter, so 4 dung beetles per meter squared, because this would be an area. If we were looking at something in the water, we could say 15 water boatmen per cubic meter or meter cubed. And that's because volume is meters cubed and area would be meters squared. So it can be really difficult to calculate densities depending on the population. So biologists sample populations and estimate these numbers using several different methods. We'll use a thing called quadrants, indirect counting, or the mark and recapture method. Another characteristic that we talk about when we talk about populations is distribution. And that's how individuals of a population are spaced out across a geographic area. There are 3 patterns of distribution: random, uniform, and clumped. And we're going to go through each of those 3 things and talk about why they might look like that. First, we'll talk about random distribution. So, in random distribution, the individuals show no regular pattern in how they are distributed. This pattern usually occurs when there is little social interaction between individuals. So, if we go back to our picture, random is just the species or the individuals are kind of just wherever. The next one is uniform distribution, and that is when a population shows a uniform spacing between individuals. This pattern typically occurs where individuals are territorial or are competing for a scarce resource. So, uniform is typically pretty evenly spread out. Finally, we have clumped distribution, and this pattern occurs in social animals who stay in their family groups or in their colonies during swarms or when food and shelter are patchy. So if we go back to our picture, clumped, typically they are hanging out with family or in social groups, or maybe the food is located in this specific area. So that is clumped distribution. Now, distribution patterns can change. Population with a random pattern may take on a uniform or clumped pattern during breeding season, or populations with a clumped pattern in winter may take on a more random pattern in summer. These patterns can change when food resources change or maybe different predation pressures change. So the monarch butterfly, in the summer, we very rarely see them together. You typically only see one monarch butterfly in a space at a time. But in the winter, you would see them all clumped in one area just because they maybe need to stay warm, or maybe they're just, it's breeding season, things of that nature. So let's get into the final way that we talk about populations, and that's the growth rate. A population's growth rate describes whether the population size is increasing, decreasing, or remaining constant. Population size is affected by birth rate, death rate, immigration, and emigration. So, when we look at birth rate and death rate, if the number of individuals born is greater than the number of individuals that die, then the population may grow. Immigration is when individuals move into geographic boundaries of the population, and emigration is the opposite when they move out of those geographic boundaries of the population. And there are a lot of things that can affect whether individuals are moving in or out of a population. It can be things like food, shelter, space, mates, and even predation. So let's get into the specifics of population growth. There are two types of ways that populations can grow. They usually exhibit these two patterns. The first is exponential growth, and that's a growth at a constant rate of increase per unit time. And then there's logistic growth, which is a growth that increases at a constant amount per unit time. So, exponential growth, typically it will only occur under ideal conditions with unlimited resources. It's very unlikely that a population is going to stay at exponential growth for forever. You're eventually going to run out of resources. But a population can grow exponentially, producing what looks like a J-shaped curve. Then we have logistic growth, and this is where a population's growth starts to slow and then stops growing following a period of exponential growth. So the graph would start kind of exponential, like that J shape, and then it would start to kind of level off. So why would that growth rate level off? There are a couple of things that can increase that, or that can affect this happening. The birth rate could decrease, the death rate could increase, immigration could decrease, or emigration could increase. So let's talk about that leveling off. When birth rate and immigration and death rate and emigration begin to equal, population growth stops. Population size will level off at the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that a particular environment can support. So if we go back to this graph, the carrying capacity is right up here, and that's when the environment can no longer doesn't have enough resources for this population to keep growing. That's why it starts to level off. It typically won't go much past the carrying capacity. So let's talk about some limiting factors. Separately or collectively, limiting factors determine the carrying capacity of an environment for a given species. There are two types of limiting factors: density dependent or density independent. Density dependent limiting factors affect population growth when a population density reaches a certain limit. So the density is dependent on the population around that specific individual. So this can include things like competition, predation, parasitism and disease, stress from overcrowding. And talking about competition, when populations become dense, individuals compete for space, food, water, and shelter. At a certain density, that population uses up all of those resources, and birth rates and emigration decrease, and death rates and immigration increase. Competing constantly also allows stress on individuals and makes them super susceptible for disease. So let's go into density independent limiting factors. Those affect a population regardless of that density. So This includes things like unusual weather, like floods, droughts, cold spells, and heat waves, or natural hazards like wildfires, volcanoes, earthquakes, or meteor impacts. So, biologists often try to manage populations, and we can do that by manipulating these limiting factors to either increase or decrease population sizes. So, we could go through and add another species into a population that's density dependent, and we could cause a shift in how many of each species is in that population. So, let's get into population interactions. We have looked at some graphical presentation representations, of population interactions. We're going to do that in class together. These relationships can have a positive, negative, or neutral effect on individual species. So maybe this will sound familiar to you. Symbiosis means living together. But when we use that word symbiosis in biology, what we're actually talking about is a close, long term interaction between two species. There are several types of symbiosis. There's mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and I can't say it. Amensalism. Sorry, I had to get my brain together to say that. So let's start with mutualism. Mutualism is a type of interaction in which both species benefit from the interaction. So typically, the host is the larger organism in a symbiotic relationship, upon or inside of which smaller organisms live, and a symbiont is a smaller organism in a symbiotic relationship that lives in or on the host. And those don't necessarily apply to mutualism, but just in general, when we're talking about population interactions, there's a host and a symbiont. Next, we have commensalism, and that's an association between two different species where one species gets some type of benefit and the other species isn't really affected by that other species being there. So, commensalism is sometimes hard to prove because in any symbiotic relationship, the likelihood that a very closely associated organism has no effect whatsoever on the other organism is pretty unlikely. Then we have parasitism, and that's an association between two different species where the symbiont benefits and the host is harmed. Vectors, or organisms that transmit disease causing pathogens to other species of animals, are typically the culprit in parasitism. So think lice, ticks, fleas, bacteria that make us sick. Then we have amensalism. That's an association between organisms of two different species in which one is inhibited or destroyed and the other is unaffected. So, bread mold and bacteria. All right, let's get into energy transfer. Energy transfer between populations. In biology, troph or trophy refers to nourishment. And we've talked about these terms a little bit in class already. Autotroph and heterotroph. So, how does this affect population interactions? We know all animals must eat other organisms, or at the very least, use those secretions of other organisms to acquire energy. We can follow a sequence of organisms that feed on each other to create what we call a food chain, or a sequence of organisms that feed on each other. A food chain always starts with an organism that gets its energy from a biotic source. So think about the sun. An organism that gets its energy from an abiotic source is called a producer. An organism that gets its energy from other organisms is called a consumer. So a food chain can be divided up into different trophic levels, or levels of a food chain where organisms attain their energy. So typically, when we look at food chains, the producers are on the bottom. Then we have primary consumers that eat those producers, secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers, tertiary consumers that eat the secondary, and so on. Energy will decrease with each increase in the trophic level. So, energy for higher trophic levels is also constrained by loss due to metabolic respiration, as well as defensive strategies in some organisms that lowers the quality of food. Trophic pyramids portray transfer of energy between trophic levels. So, typically, let me go back here. I'm sure it's coming up in the notes, but typically, every level that you go up, you're losing 10% of the energy from the previous level. That's kind of confusing, but we'll get into that hopefully coming up. So, when we look at these typically represent biomass. This is how many organisms live in this trophic level. So, if we're looking at terrestrial ecosystems, we have a lot of primary producers, a few herbivores, not very many primary carnivores, and even less secondary carnivores. And we can do that also again down here. Hold on, I think I explained that wrong. So, this is the biomass over here, and this is the amount of energy that's being transferred in between. So, these ones have the most energy, least, less, even less than the previous. And this is the biomass. So, these two are about the same. When we look at the aquatic ecosystems, the primary producers, again, have the most energy, and these two trophic levels look the exact same, right? Regardless of the ecosystem. But the biomass is different. We have way more secondary carnivores, less primary carnivores, even less herbivores, and very, very few primary producers in aquatic ecosystems. So I know that's a little bit confusing. We're going to practice, and hopefully, I'm going to try to get you a worksheet that explains the 10% thing that I was talking about earlier, because there's some math we can do with that. And we could figure out exactly how much energy the tertiary consumer was able to get from eating the secondary consumer. So that's the end of the notes video. Again, we're going to practice in class, so don't panic if you're a little bit confused by any of this. This was a long note video. I understand. So come find me if you have any questions.